Gordon because Gordon has such a wonderful history that he's going to, just as he talks, he'll tell us everything that's going on, and we'll learn a lot about him at the same time. So everyone, thank you for coming out tonight. I hope you're all staying safe, being very careful, taking good care of yourself. Thank you for wearing your mask, and make sure you sign in. I'm sure Susan's taking care of that. So without further ado, Gordon Kennison, everyone.
Okay, I am heavily wired.
Good.
I'm on the second microphone, and I apparently have one that's attached over there to the Win TV camera. So I'm going to try to get some of this right. I wasn't really going to pay that much attention to it, but now I have to. I'm Gordon Kennison, and some of you know me. I hold degrees in horticulture, history, and political science. And I may use all of them tonight because we're going to talk about the history of the first Thanksgiving. Why? 400 years ago, 1621, in Plymouth, Massachusetts, my grandfather, by the way, I've done my genealogy, so I talk mostly about me and my relatives. Everything else is incidental. But my grandfather, William Bradford, wrote a book, and he also came up with the idea of having a gathering. He did not call it Thanksgiving. In fact, it wasn't a Thanksgiving. We'll get into that in a minute, but this is, as I say, the 400th anniversary of a group of people that I think you've probably heard of. We tend to call them pilgrims. They never did call themselves that because my grandfather wrote it in his book saying they know they were pilgrims. But his book disappeared for hundreds of years. It wasn't discovered until the mid-1800s, or rediscovered, I should say. And in there it mentioned the Pilgrims. Before that, they didn't call themselves that. They hadn't heard him say it. He wrote it. He lost it. But they called themselves separatists. Why? Because they wanted to separate from the Church of England. They thought it was getting too visceral, too highfalutin, and just too ornate, worshiping idols and things like that, and they just wanted to get away from it. And as it turned out, they were also being persecuted by the powers that be. They could be raided, they could be put in jail. Many of them were hung just for being Protestant and separatist to boot. So they needed to get out. They first fled, for the most part, many of them to Holland, which was a much more open place, and they could worship freely. But they got worried. They said, oh my goodness, we've been here almost a generation and our kids are becoming too Dutch. So they got the idea, we're going to go to America. And I won't bore you with the whole story because it's very lengthy, but they finally got themselves a charter in the northern part of Virginia, the Hudson River. Think about it. Virginia was a lot bigger than it is now. So anyway, that's where they were headed. They never made it. They set out in September 6th, actually, of 1620, and excuse me, they didn't show up for 2 months, and they ended up at Cape Cod near Provincetown. And it had to do with storms and other things like that. But they were at sea for 65 days aboard this. Have you ever seen the model of the Mayflower, the replica? It's not very big. And so all these people, the animals and everything else were on there. There was 102 people when they started. About 50 of them were the ones we call pilgrims, separatists. They called themselves saints as well. The other half was a group of people that they called either the strangers, because they didn't know who they were, or the adventurers. These were people that were going to the new land to find their fortune type of thing. So they traveled together. They didn't necessarily like each other, but they were stuck traveling on an average at 2 miles an hour across the Atlantic Ocean. It's a long trip. Even today, that would be a horrible trip, but at least there might be a bathroom, you know? Well, anyway, they got here. They suffered miserably, as I'm sure you have heard. That is not a myth. They were saved by Native Americans who did help them supply themselves with certain types of food, which these people, by the way, were mostly weavers and accountants and businessmen. One was a printer, Edward Winslow, who wrote the first account of Thanksgiving. And they didn't know anything about farming or gardening. They learned, and they learned quickly. Unfortunately, in the first year, half of them died. And that includes, eventually they just took the 102 people, whether they were separatists or strangers, they called them all pilgrims. And those people, 102 of them, there's about 50 standing when 1621 rolled around. So it was a tough time, but in 1621, another grandfather, I was so surprised. My 9th great-grandfather, my 8th great-grandfather, George Morton, wrote a book called Mort's Relation. Why Mort's? Because the person that printed it couldn't spell. So he became Mort. And he almost never, that's even better. He almost never came over here until the very couple of years later on one of the last ships that came to the original colony. And then he was here for about a year and he died. But he was in London doing business for the colony as much as they could, because their purpose of being here was to make money for the people that paid for the ship, as well as to make their own colony and have their religious freedom. But they had to provide goods for this adventure, as it was called, because they didn't own the ship. They had to pay for their travel, so to speak. So anyway, while they were doing their thing, he, as I say, was in England. And I'm going to have to put this down. I'll try to talk loudly, but I just want to read you one little paragraph, because this is the whole story in writing that is known as Thanksgiving. Okay, can you hear me? Yes. Yay. In Mort's Relations, it says, "Our harvest being gotten in, our governor, William Bradford, sent 4 men on fowling, that so we might after a special manner rejoice together after we had gathered the fruit of our labors. They 4 in one day killed as much fowl as with a little help beside served the company almost a week, at which time, amongst other recreations, we exercised our arms." They weren't flapping their arms, they carried guns. "Many of the Indians, as they called them, cometh amongst us, and among them rests their greatest king, Massasoit, who was the Sachem or chief of the Wampanoag Indians, and with some 90 men. And they said, whom for these 3 days we entertained and feasted, and they went out and killed 5 deer, which they brought to the plantation and bestowed on our governor and upon the captain and others. And although it be not always so plentiful as it was at this time with us, yet the goodness of God, we are so far from want that we often wish you partakers of our plenty." From that, we created a holiday. Several things on that. If you can hear me, I'm not even going to bother to use this. If you can't, I will gladly attempt to use it. Okay. How's that? I know, I was seeing if they were really paying attention. Okay. Where was I? Oh, yeah. So anyway, that was the description that people over time had to work with. And as I say, they did not call the holiday Thanksgiving. The Pilgrims did have Thanksgivings. They were a single-day event, extremely religious. They were for fasting and looking inward, and they only did it on a few occasions. That was a typical thing throughout the Anglo world at the time, and it was, the Anglican Church would do the same thing. What this really was a feast, a harvest feast. And, the English had been doing that, the Arabians had been doing that, the Native Americans had been doing that. Harvest feast was nothing new. But they'd had such a wonderful year, they were so grateful to be there, plus they had all this company. There's a question whether they were invited or just showed up, but when 90 people come and you're only 50, you say, sure, you can stay, we'll have a party. And they did. Now, we know what they had to eat, right? They had turkey, they had mashed potatoes, they had gravy, they had pumpkin pie, they had apple pie, they had beer, green bean grass. No, they didn't have any of that. When they set out from Plymouth, England, they had a bag of flour by the time 2 months later they showed up at what became Plymouth, Massachusetts, they didn't have a bag of flour. Hard to make a pumpkin pie or much else without that. They didn't have a cow. They had no milk. They had no butter. They had no cheese. You can't make that. They didn't have apples. They didn't have sugar. And partly, I'm not just saying because they didn't remember to bring it, they ate it all. They just didn't have it. They just didn't have it. The world didn't. Many of their things were not available to them. They were learning some new plants here in this country, one of which, of course, we know as the jack-o'-lantern or pumpkin. But they couldn't make a pie out of it. So they did what they did with almost everything else. They boiled it. And we'll get to it in just a second as to what they had, because I don't want to dwell on this. I want to go through what they did, what they had, what it was really like. I could talk for hours on the subject, but you'd be long gone, and so would the microphone, but it really wouldn't matter. But anyway, let's see. I've got these notes, but I also have really bad eyes these days. I've got one cataract left to go. I guess that means I only had one done, huh? Yeah. Whew. Okay. So they sailed to Virginia. I've covered that. Okay. There were several attempts to make this a national holiday and actually to call it a Thanksgiving. General George Washington tried it twice. In 1777, he got the idea, let's have a day of Thanksgiving. Didn't fly. Nobody liked it. They were too busy fighting a war. So that never went anywhere. In 1789, he tried it again. Said, let's do it, and said, we're going to do it a lot. And we might do it at the end of November, the end of the year, November. And so that went, and that didn't go anywhere either. Partly because people like Thomas Jefferson and whatnot said, why on earth do we want to celebrate a bunch of raggle-taggle people who went off and got themselves nearly killed and almost died in the woods? That's not worth a holiday. So that ended. But then in 1863, Abraham Lincoln, who gets all the credit, came up with the idea and said, let's have a national day of Thanksgiving. He was just trying to brighten things up because the country was in a pretty miserable state at the time with the war going. And he thought it'd be a good idea to look back. And he really encouraged people to learn more about the so-called pilgrims or forefathers, which they really didn't care about. But anyway, he tried to get that going. He tried a little bit. It didn't fly, didn't go anywhere. But then this woman by the name of Sarah Josepha Hale. Ever hear of her? No. Okay, good. Anyway, she was the editor of Godey's magazine, Godeys. And Mr. Godey had started this magazine for women. And he'd run it for about 2 years and was barely making enough money to eat on when he hired her. Well, she had all these great ideas, and they went from a circulation of 10,000 copies in 2 years of her effort as being editor to 150,000 copies. Now, this is 1863. That's a lot of circulation. But one of her grand ideas was Thanksgiving. She loved the idea. And she would write Lincoln once a month, sometimes more often. She went down to visit. She kept hounding him and hounding him and hounding him. And finally he said, you know, I was thinking about it. You're right. I tried it. Didn't work. Let's do it. So they made it a holiday. And when was that holiday? That was a question. That wasn't a rhetorical question. Okay. Okay. Very good. Now, as I mentioned before, I think I did anyway, the Pilgrims event did not happen in November. It was a harvest festival. It was September, October. They don't really know. They didn't talk about it. They didn't write much down other than what you've heard. They didn't write dates or the names even of most of the people that were there. Oh, by the way, you can't see it from where you are, I'm sure. This is a little tiny one. I have a much bigger one hanging on my wall, but I chose not to bring it because if it fell and broke, I'd lose it, and you're just not that important. But this is a lovely painting, and it's considered to be the most authentic representation of the first Thanksgiving. Well, the first Thanksgiving was not the first Thanksgiving. Matter of fact, it wasn't even called that until 1841, when a fellow that had written an article to someone, and he, at the bottom, he mentioned the Pilgrims, and he said, oh, and by the way, this was the first Thanksgiving. Before that, nobody had ever heard of that. He came up with that. Secondly, if you look at the picture carefully, we can go over the details, but about the only thing that's accurate are really more or less the people that are there. And there's a little tiny picture here that is Grandfather Bradford. Now remember, Grandfather Morton is still in England at the time. Well, anyway, so Lincoln came up with that idea. He made it the fourth Thursday of November. And then Franklin Roosevelt in 1941, when got a little pressure from the business people who wanted more time between Thanksgiving and Christmas to sell stuff, he moved it back a week. Nobody in the country paid any attention to it. He made the declaration. They just waited. They celebrated on the day they normally did. And finally he conceded. The business people conceded, and they said, okay, so it is the fourth Thursday of November, celebrating an event that actually took place in October and wasn't called Thanksgiving. Now, as I pointed out, they didn't have turkey. And that's interesting because in about 1500 or so, the Spanish conquistadors in Mexico discovered the turkey. Well, they didn't discover it. They tripped over it. It was already here. Everybody knew about it in their known world. But anyway, they found this thing, and it was a turkey. They brought him back to Spain. And the Spanish had him for a few years, and then guess what? They brought him over to England. So from around the mid-1500s on, the English people were well aware of what we call the wild turkey. But there is no actual mention in any of this that that's what they had for dinner. They probably did. They probably did. They were everywhere. And they went out, when they called it, in here they refer to it as they went a-fowling. But that covered almost anything they could shoot that had wings. And they also used the term turkey to talk about any bird that had a sort of baldish head. Now, you've seen a turkey, not a lot of fuzz up there. So anyway, they may or may not have had turkey. What they did with it is, if they did have it, whatever they did have as far as fowl goes, they roasted some of the smaller ones on an open spit. Sounds nice, right? That's not bad. I like that. They boiled the rest of it. Remember, I think I mentioned already about pumpkin? They boiled everything. If you look at colonial meals, they were stews or pottages, and you just got a big pot and you just kept throwing stuff in. And, it wasn't necessarily a bad thing, but it was one level texture and, kind of mushy consistency. But that's what they did, and it was the easiest way, and it's really all they had. They had none of their ovens had come over, on the Mayflower. That was another joke, but we missed that. And I told you about the potatoes. The potato hadn't been discovered yet to them, and they had no apples. Those came much later. They had no bread for the stuffing. They would have stuffed their birds probably with nuts and herbs. And we'll get to the herbs and things in a minute because I know you're all dying to talk about herbs. So, and usually when I talk about herbs, I end up talking about everything but. So I'll try very hard not to do that. Then I want to mention down here that why they know all of this. How do they know it? And why do they know it? Are people trying to destroy Thanksgiving? No, Thanksgiving is a wonderful thing. The people that are doing most of the research on this are food historians and other historians at Plymouth Plantation, which is now known as the Plymouth Pawtuxet Museum. Who's been there? Oh, good. They use other methods. They have these two accounts, obviously, because I would say two because this grandfather copied that grandfather and wrote it in his book too, but it's no different. It's the same words. So anyway, they use other things, and they use. Let me see. Here's my list here. Well, the prominent one, by the way, is a woman by the name of Kathleen Curtin, who for 16 years worked at Plymouth as a food historian, and she has left there, and she's written a book called Give Thanks, Pilgrims to Pumpkin Pie, and it's filled with recipes. I know you're all expecting to leave here tonight with, all the charming herb recipes and whatnot, but hey, this is only an hour long. you know, buy the book. So remember that, it's called Thanksgiving. There's some other words in there, but then it ends with Pilgrims to Pumpkin Pie. And it really seems like a good book. I have it on order, otherwise I would have brought it tonight. Okay, but there were cookbooks at the time, they used those. They actually had oral Wampanoag histories of what was served and what people ate. They had paintings, and they had archaeology. They've studied all of them, trying to piece those things together. And again, a lot of it is speculation, but they do know pretty much what was available as far as herbs in 1600. There is an excellent book, which does not seem to have appeared in my bag, but it's by Rudy Favretti. Does anybody know Dr. Rudy Favretti at UConn? Anybody here ever been like a gardener or anything like that? Okay. Rudy for years, he's a professor emeritus now, did period planting classes. He taught people what was around, say you had an older house and you wanted to have authentic plants or something similar to what should be there and that type of thing. He would teach it. Also did a lot of research on rural cemeteries such as Cedar Hill in Hartford and Mount Auburn in Massachusetts. He just was an all-around very interesting man, or is one, on plants. But he and his wife wrote a book, and it's called Planting for Period Houses. And in that book are lists by period, 1600 to say 1699. And things change, they don't change that much. It lists everything that was known to be available. And if you could name it as far as an herb goes, and believe it or not, one of the accounts actually said they had rosemary, sage. Anybody know the rest of that? Right, they had them all. And they used them to some degree. Everything that we know just about for the common herbs today was available to them. And they probably did use it. So you can picture that they were stuffing with herbs, maybe cooking a little bit with them. They didn't do too much of that because they boiled everything, and these were Puritans. Herbs they taste good. It makes you a little bit too happy. You don't want to seem that happy. You can be happy in private, don't be happy in public. So they had the herbs, but even, I read an interesting book called Spices, which talks about the spice trade in 600 pages, but they talk about it throughout the world. And one of the things was the Anglo-Saxons started the trend away from spiciness. The Puritans picked it up and carried that ball and said, eh. They used it a lot in cookies and desserts. That they liked. And I brought this because this is one of the first cookbooks in later New England here. This is The Art of Cookery by Mrs. Glasse, Glasse. And her recipes are just filled with using herbs, but it's always for sweets, not for that type of cooking. Now that obviously is a little bit later. She wrote that in 1774, but that shows the trend. They almost used no herbs for any other type of cooking. And the Pilgrims were slow to give it up, but they were steady about it. And that's sort of where the tradition, you've all heard, I would assume, that if you go to England, don't expect a very exciting diet. Bland, that's the word that is used. And they've tried to change it now, obviously, because people come and they don't want bland. But in those days, pilgrims that went back to London would report, and then they went to, say, some other country, and they go, oh, it was not a diet like good for us. Those French people, those sauces and all that stuff, it's just so terrible, way too rich. So anyway, that is the history of their use of the herbs, but they did have everything. But now, let's talk about what kind of food was there at the first Thanksgiving that they can either point to or they know it existed. These people lived in a wonderland of food. They were surrounded by it. And one of the ironies of that is when they first showed up in Plymouth, they didn't know how to fish. They didn't know how to fish. And they were sitting on top of an inlet attached to an ocean that contained fish, lots of them. One of the most prominent types of sea life were shellfish. There were mussels, there were clams, A little further out from Plymouth, there are oysters. The Native Americans finally told them where they were, but before that, they had started to figure out some of the other things. There was, like I said, there was a lobster. They didn't like that as much because it was too plentiful. It was common. And the Native Americans used it. They didn't eat it at all. They used it as bait to catch other things. And what they were catching is they wanted bluefish, they had cod, they had striped bass. I mean, this was just tremendous. And so they know that at that so-called table on Thanksgiving Day, there probably was some birds and there was some venison, but most likely it was predominantly fish of all kinds. Not so bad. Not so bad a living. But that was one year. By the way, the first Thanksgiving, whether it was called that or something else, never happened again. It was also the last Thanksgiving. Until years later, as I say, Washington and others started to pick it up, and people said, hey, that's great. And we now have a holiday that I think most of us really enjoy. I know it is probably my favorite. I like it far more than Christmas. I like family, even the ones that aren't dead. But it's just a warm feeling. And I think this was a very good example of that. Plus, it was an interesting time because of the efforts of a man named Edward Winslow, who was by trade was a printer, but was one of the major leaders of the Pilgrim group, as well as my grandfather. They really had a lot of sense of diplomacy. And the Native Americans had their own problems. They, of course, had been suffering horrible diseases because they'd come in contact with white people before, and Europeans, whether it's this or if you ever read Shogun, everywhere they went, they brought every known disease to man. They all seem to have started not only in Europe, but mostly in London. They almost know the street. Everything that you could get came from there. So they lost a lot of people. And so when the Mayflower arrived, it was like there was nobody around. Wow. Of course, there were some people around, and they finally got to meet them. They didn't like each other at all at first, but then they realized they had a commonality. They had reasons to get along. They didn't have to be the best of friends, and you couldn't trust either one. You know, don't turn your back on the Pilgrim and don't turn your back on the Wampanoag or anybody else, but you can get along. And they did that for years until the next generation of so-called Pilgrims came along, and just like kids everywhere, they ruin everything. And they hadn't suffered as much. They didn't know that, and they saw this land, and we're going to take it, and we're going to do this. And before you know it, you had the worst conflict between Native Americans and white settlers ever, with King Philip's War, and then later the Pequot Wars. But up until then, they had really established something that would be really good if we could do it again today. So I just thought I'd throw that in. That was the political science. Remember I said I was going to get that in there? Okay. So anyway, some of the other things that they had, in case you want to copy what they did, just remember to get yourself some big pots to boil stuff. I really can't picture boiled venison, so I will not allow that they did that. That they roasted. I'm sure they did. Another big one, and this is, except one of the people who described it, they said, you're sitting down with a nice couple of pieces of bread and a couple of slices of turkey the next day, maybe a little stuffing and cranberry on it. How would you like to do that with eel? Forget the stuffing and the cranberry and the bread, but they had the eel. Eel were incredibly plentiful, and it was the job of Native American women to dive into the water, go down and get the eels and bring them up. And then, of course, I guess the Pilgrims started copying them too. They just didn't have that many women to do it. By the way, the entire meal for these 3 days was cooked by 4 adult women and 2 girls. There were some young boys. They sent them out together, nuts, berries, things like that. And that's a lot of work when you've got, let's see, 90 and 50. Holy mackerel, that's a lot of people in 3 days to cook for. And I don't really picture too many of the guys, I've got my barbecue stuff and I'm going to do this. And no, they were sitting around. They do know, by the way, too, all the pictures, even this one, they always show them with a lovely white tablecloth. Didn't have one. Didn't have one at home, didn't have one here. You know, it's not that they left it back in England, they didn't have it. So, but they probably did have a groaning table, as they call it, a wood table. The other things they didn't have the forks yet. That came much later. And I just read an account, it was a great historical novel, took place in Boston in 1662. And it's about a young woman who is very expert with herbs. But because she becomes under suspicion because she might be a witch.
Right.
And that was one of the, smart women who had either land, property, money, and knew something about herbs. Let's get rid of them, take their land, money, etc. But anyway, I forgot where I was going with that. So anyway, watch out for those smart women. But so that's what they had. They just had those few women doing all of that work. And they did have cabbage. They know they had turnips. They had parsnips, onions, leeks, carrots, parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme, Jerusalem artichoke, beans, peas. By the way, the account is their crop came in. Remember where he says that our crops are there? If you go a little bit further, it says we had corn, plenty and plenty of corn. Well, it's the corn that's called flint. It's not a sweet corn, I can assure you. But they made their substitute for bread out of it. You would boil it, mash it, mix it with whatever you had, and fry it in venison fat and eat that. And so that was like their bread. So they had that. Their corn crop was excellent. Their pea crop is described as less than excellent, pathetic. They didn't really have access to watering plants very well, and it was an incredibly hot summer after an incredibly cold winter, and all the peas kind of burned up. But they did have some peas, but not enough to really write home about. They did have some barley. It finally grew. Now, remember I said they had no beer? Well, they had no beer because they had no barley. Now they got the barley, but when your barley crop comes in September or October, it's kind of hard to have beer for the first holiday, which took place, a month later or a few weeks later. So they didn't have beer, but they eventually did. And they eventually, like I say, they had apples. They eventually had apple cider and things like that. What do you think they drank? Right, water. That's what they had. So that was probably very good for them. Let's see. I more or less have covered everything that I have on this little sheet. And let me look at the time. If it's 6:15, I'm in trouble. Oh, no. I have half an hour. Oh, my goodness. I tried to keep it down so that we wouldn't talk. So what I really wanted to do, actually the last thing on the sheet, is one, if there's any questions, and I may think of other things to tell you, you can come up here and see my heritage here, my lineage, so to speak. That should excite you. But also, I just want to know what you guys have for Thanksgiving. And that is one of the things that the historians do at places like Plymouth. They interview people and they say, what has Thanksgiving become? What do you see as Thanksgiving? Most of us have the real basic stuff, but everybody's got something a little different. And that makes it interesting. And that's also, they're collecting that too. Yes?
So I was wondering, what about chestnuts?
Roasting on an open fire? How romantic. Probably not. Again, nothing was specified. Chestnuts are more of an English thing at that time. They may have had them there. They didn't get into that too much here.
What about all of our native berries?
Well, they just describe them as berries. We don't know what they ate, but a lot of them were available. Oh, that brings me to the cranberry. I didn't really go into detail on the cranberry. Of course, they had a big, huge cranberry bog, right? No, that didn't happen. That happened about 100 years later, and they figured out how to grow cranberries. The Indians, I'll call them that because they did, knew what to do with cranberries. They were garbage. You cooked them, it was a survival food. They called it pemmican. And it was just ground up, mixed with water or whatever you had, and then dried, and then you carried around and you nibbled it on like trail mix type of thing. They had no idea, they'd never seen any of them, not the Native Americans, not the Pilgrims at home. They didn't know what a cranberry was. They certainly didn't know what cranberry sauce was. And even if they had, they didn't have anything sweet, except maybe maple sugar if they had known how to do that. The Native Americans did know how to do that a little bit, and they used some of that in some of their dishes. But as far as the cranberry was concerned, it was just kind of bland and boring to them.
What about gum?
Gum?
Gum tree.
What? You mean to chew gum from a gum tree? Hey, you can look it up. If you can find it, we'll add it to the list. Yeah. Oh, my dad used to chew tar. They didn't have that either. But no, there's no mentions of that. Who knows what they did? They did chew on willow bark over time. That's aspirin. So actually, it's better than aspirin. So anyway, that's cranberries. Any other questions? Oh, come on, you got to save me here. This could be the world's slowest show. Who wants to talk about what they do for Thanksgiving? No, not yet. They had that later. About the time of the Pequot Wars, the colonials were taught how to grow squash. Pumpkin is a squash technically, or a gourd, but that was about the only one that they know of. Again, it's what we know of, and what they can speculate on to a certain degree. So what do you like?
Duck.
Duck. Good. Eagle? Oh, you like seagull? Oh, I'm asking what you like.
Geese.
No, I don't think they were too big on the seagulls. I don't think they, let's see, where would the seagull have been by then? Who knows? Wasn't that far up, I don't think.
Canadian geese, I know Canada then.
Well, the geese might have been around, yeah, but there's no mention of it whatsoever. So what can I say?
Gordon, you did say I mentioned yams or potatoes of some sort. There
No,
were
at that
no
no,
potatoes.
no. That all came from later colonies and later peoples, and from the natives and south of us, South America, things like that. Well, I'll tell you what I like. Yes.
So you said, let's pick it up. They had herbs. So did the Native Americans at that time, I know they must have had herbs because for medicinal purposes, but did they introduce the herbs to the early colonists?
Once they really started talking to each other, there was a tremendous back and forth for many, many, many years, because the plant base in New England, let's say, is quite different than what grows in England. Things will grow interchangeably in the climates, but what's available in one was not available in the other. As a matter of fact, they know for a fact that the day that they left from England, a ship arrived from the other colonies. Remember, there's other colonies kicking around in the New World. They were not the first white people that the Native Americans had ever seen. They didn't necessarily bring the diseases that killed most of the Native Americans. And by the way, it isn't smallpox that they really probably died from by the great numbers. It's a bacterial disease called leptospirosis. But at any rate, the same time they were leaving, a ship was coming in from the colonies, and it carried plant material. And it was plant material. Now, you mentioned it about the medicinal use. The main purpose of herbs throughout time, the primary use, is medicine. The culinary comes along second, easily discovered because you're taking your medicine and it tastes good. And, supercalifragilistic, you eat your medicine. But yes, even today, 30% of our medicines are still plant-based. Many of them to the point where they actually still use the actual plants and not some type of synthetic reproduction of what the plant had to offer. For example, aspirin is a synthetic material that comes from members of the willow family, whereas the natives actually chewed, I think it made reference to it, they chewed on the branches. And it worked better, and also apparently, and it's been tried over the years, it doesn't cause stomach upset. There's something in the willow tree that even today they have not isolated and confined that buffers the effects of the rest of the acetylsalicylic acid, which eats our stomachs away in many cases, you know. So yeah, that would have been the primary reason for it, but
Did sassafras exist?
sure. Oh, all these, you know, I mean, most things have existed since the dawn of time. It's whether or not somebody recognized them. I mean, you can dig up, they have England gardens that they know date back to 4 BC. And they can, through DNA and material diggings and whatnot, they can find out what's in those gardens. And it's, you know, nothing, I mean, it's nothing really new. It's really, most everything's been around for just about ever. It's just what people have done with it and learned from it. So,
Like potatoes coming from Peru.
right, right,
They were there forever, but
right. And of course, you know, the tomato traveled around the world before it came back here because people here were afraid of it.
I didn't realize that Jerusalem artichokes were made.
Yeah. Anybody grow Jerusalem artichokes? Are you familiar with them? I'm sure you do. If you don't, I'd be surprised. I love the Jerusalem artichoke.
How do you prepare them so that
You
you
boil
don't?
Yeah, you boil it, right? You do. You do. Yeah, see? He's been listening. Well, he should have been taking notes, come on. But actually, they're a beautiful plant if you're tall. They grow at least 6 to 7 feet tall, and the flower is always at the top. It's a lovely little yellow daisy-like flower, and most people will never see it unless they bend the plant over. But very prolific and a wonderful plant. I know that. We told you. It won. I mean, you can try anything you want with them. You know, you can mash them and, you know, whatever.
Have you ever eaten them?
Yes.
Do you find that you have a interesting side effect when you eat them?
I'd rather not talk about that. No, I've had no side effects from Jerusalem artichokes that I'm aware of.
Oh, okay.
Asparagus, on the other hand, yes.
We discovered that if we eat Jerusalem artichokes, we get a burst of wind.
Yep, that would be not a surprise. But, you know, nothing wrong with that. Yes. Oh, period plantings, but it's by Rudy. He's got several. They all have almost the same name, but any one of them is good. But one with the list is, I believe, period plantings for, oh, I wish I'd remembered to bring it, an older home. But it's Rudy Favretti, Favretti, and his wife, Joy. Favretti. Yeah. I tried not to miss all the syllables. And it's a very good book. But he's got others too. But that one has those lists that come in very handy. Anybody else? Come on. I was really counting on questions. Or somebody talking about what they have for Thanksgiving. Does anybody here celebrate Thanksgiving? We're familiar with it then.
Traditional Thanksgiving,
Oh, good. What is that?
turkey,
Yep.
mashed potatoes, corn, gravy,
Mhm.
pumpkin pie, apple pie,
That sounds about right. Yeah.
stuffing.
You know, creamed onions, green bean casserole, as somebody said, green gelatin.
I have a question.
Yeah.
The 102 original pilgrims, strangers, whichever, how many generations were they prior to the next wave of immigrants coming in? Were there a couple of generations, or was that pretty immediate?
It was pretty immediate because,
The infiltration of the
yeah, the Mayflower came in 1620. In 1621, it went home, never to be seen again. It never went anywhere else. It never existed anymore. It was destroyed. It rotted at the side of the harbor and was burned, as far as they know. But behind it were ships. The next one was the Fortune, and that showed up here around 1623. But that brought the families of many of the people who had come over originally.
I guess what I was driving at, is that a big genetic focal
Oh,
society or something? That 102 population?
oh, well, from that, there are 35 million people in the Mayflower Society, or could be in the Mayflower Society. They would love it to get them and have everybody pay $1 to join, but that hasn't happened. And I mean, standing and living right at the moment, but a lot of people don't even know that they're in it or could be in it.
That population from that 102 is
Yep.
35 million?
Well, actually, it's from 50. Only about 50 people are known. This book lists all of the folks that were there and the ones that left descendants. Because, obviously a lot of them died aboard. Some died aboard ship. There were some born aboard ship, one, and many died there. Some were, we had one family in particular is known because the father murdered someone, and he was the first person hung in New England, in the colonies. A wonderful honor. I met one of his descendants. She works for the East Hartford Town Clerk. But like I say, the other families came along that already existed. Then other people started coming, and like for instance, William Bradford was married to a woman by the name of May, and she came across with him, leaving their son Nathan behind. When they got to Providence, after a little while, and nobody's really sure, she either fell overboard or she just quietly jumped overboard because she couldn't take it anymore, or what. There's a lot of speculation. I mean, she may have had a heart attack and died. No one knows. But at that point, he had no other descendants than the son. The son never had any descendants either. But he married his second wife, a woman by the name, well, she actually goes by about 4 names, but Southwood is the best known of her multiple husbands and whatnot. And between them, they had quite a few kids. And from them, thousands and thousands and thousands of people have come. The most prolific person on the Mayflower was a fellow by the name of Howland. He's the one sometimes you hear about, fell overboard, and luckily somehow caught onto one of the guide ropes that was hanging and floated along behind and screaming and hollering, and finally they noticed him and pulled him back. Well, you probably have seen it. Who here has seen the Peanuts cartoon on the voyage of the Mayflower? Come on, it's every year. This is the dullest group I've ever met. My God, unbelievable. Anyway, there's a scene where he falls overboard and they bring him back on. This is where you get your history. That's a good question, though. But anybody else? Come on. Normally people are just dying to ask questions. You people are just dying.
Is there something special happening for the 400 at Plymouth?
Well, last year, 2020, was the big year. That was the 400th anniversary of the Pilgrims arriving and landing. And the events that they had planned were tremendous. There was all kinds of things happening. And I had learned that I was a descendant shortly before. I was verified by the Mayflower Society. I had my hat, my shirt, and everything but my, little beanie or something. And I was ready to go. And I have a very dear friend who was funny because as soon as I found out, I was so excited, that I was related. And as I'm going, by the way, if you don't do Ancestry, do it. It's a lot of fun. It's amazing the people that I've found in my tree. Just, they don't affect me one way or the other, but they're fascinating folks. I'm a cousin to Laura Ingalls, for example. I'm the 14th great, he was actually, my 14th great-grand uncle was Chaucer. But that's through Robert Frost, And so you just find all these people that probably wouldn't have liked me if they'd known me. They didn't leave me any money. They wouldn't let me in if I went to their house. At least none of them are trying to get money from me, which is good. But it's just fun to learn. And, once again, I just lost my train of thought. I'm just sitting here thinking and losing it. Anyway, any more? What?
Last year it was the 2020.
Oh, yeah, I was talking about that. Right. So anyway, we were all set to go, and of course, we didn't have it. It all got canceled. And not for that, not really, no. Matter of fact, I think the only event that I know of is the Connecticut Mayflower Society is having their annual dinner at the, the Chowder Pot or something like that in Hartford. A fish plate you sit next to the sewage plant. So that's the biggest whoopee I know about. But anyway, I know what I was going to say. I walked in, I remember the first church, and we're an old colonial church, congregational church, so we're as Puritan as they come or used to be. We're not so much anymore, thank goodness. But anyway, I walked into the church one morning, I said, my goodness, I'm related to William Bradford, and half the people inside the church said, so are we. Talk about deflation, like, wow, well, I guess I'm not special. There you go. Yes?
How does Sturbridge Village fit into this picture?
Not at all. Sturbridge Village is set in 1830. And other than the fact that it's just a continuation of the white man's taking over of a lot of land and whatnot, it's historically very interesting. It's a lovely place to go. And I have a great story. I went to Sturbridge Village one time with my wife, and we had a little pass that we got from the Hartford Current, and it was for $2. So we get in, and my wife went, oh my goodness, I forgot the pass. And they said, well, oh, you got a pass? Yeah, she said, I have AAA, and they said, no, you have to actually have the pass from them. Oh, but she said, I've got it in my car from the Current. Oh, well, why didn't you say so? And at that time, I used to carry a camera with a really long lens, and just because I liked having a really long lens and felt really important. Well, that day, it worked, because they said, you just go right on through. And the next thing we know, we're wearing big, huge badges, VIP. We're brought around to everybody. We got around the other side with the docents. They showed us how to make things, and we got to look out at all those poor people that walked on by who didn't lie their way in for free. And we just had a wonderful time. And my wife kept saying, it was only a $2 pet. No, we're not, we know the Current, yeah. So ever since then, anyway, if I ever go anywhere, I carry a big camera, whether I'm going to use it or not, and I always wear a shirt that either says CBS or, NBC or something like that. You'd be surprised, we'll come up and give you things. Yes? Yes. Okay, at the first Thanksgiving, they did have some spices. They didn't have a lot of them because they were expensive. Now remember, these things were not native. Spices are not native. They don't come from here at all. Nutmeg doesn't come from here. Mace, which are from the nutmeg, doesn't come from here. But they had them. They brought them over. They carried all kinds of things. They carried seeds. They carried plants. They actually had plants. They carried, like they said, they had little recipes of medicines and how to take care of themselves, that went down through their families and were brought to this country. So yeah, they had all of that. The sugar they didn't have because it just, where does sugar come from? Not where it used to. I know that, but it didn't come from around here. Yeah. Well, they had beets and that kind of thing. But, that sugar did come into the New World eventually. As a matter of fact, it became a very dangerous thing because they used to love it so much, the early colonials, when they finally could get it, and it came through the West Indies. And they would get it, and it would come in a cone, and they'd have a special cutter to cut off slices because it was so special, and they're going to give you a piece of sugar. And you take that, right? Well, they ate so much sugar, and they took so many medicines that contained mercury, and they ate off of pewter. They basically were known as tooth challenged. And they figured, one person wrote, they said that if a young colonial woman still has one tooth in her head at the age of 39, she is considered a princess. You know.
Okay.
Hi, how you doing?
Good.
All right.
Tell me, what did they smoke?
That's an interesting question. I was going to talk about it. I didn't write it down, but they had hemp.
That's right.
And hemp has many uses. And, you know, they like to, when you go to Mount Vernon, for example, George Washington grew a lot of hemp. And they used it. I mean, they used it for rope, they use it for canvas, they use it for this, they use it for everything. You know, jungle gyms and whatnot. But hemp is also, you know, cannabis sativa. And here, of course, they can grow a type that doesn't produce seeds, supposedly, so you don't, you know, use it for other things. But they did. And of course, they really should. They were in such pain and everything was just, you know, just teeth alone, talking about teeth. My God. You know, if you think of what, you know, you worry about going to the dentist, think about what they had to go through. And how many people, you know, in the Egyptian world, they're still digging up people that died of tooth decay and, you know, sepsis of the blood from the infections in their mouths. They dug up the founder of Maryland, Lord Baltimore. They found him in a lead casket using, you know, radar. And they dug him up, and he had all kinds of abscesses, not to mention everything else. But they were not healthy people. They were not comfortable people. And even though they had certain medicines and stuff, they could only take care of so much. And so, yeah, they had hemp, and they enjoyed it. They had alcohol, and they liked that too. So, yes,
You had started talking about forks.
yes.
When did forks come into play?
Oh, probably about 1784, somewhere around in there. Forks were not a big deal. Thomas Jefferson sometimes took credit for introducing the fork. That would have been about 1800. The first ones that came were like two-tined forks. And then somebody introduced the three-tined fork, and that was known as the fork of the devil. And if you had three-tined forks, you were known to be either an agent of the devil or controlled by the devil at any rate. So you just couldn't have those three-tined forks.
No wonder there are none anymore.
That's right.